it's worth bearing in mind that the lifeblood of any city and what makes London particularly competitive in its history right now are the people that inhabit the urban environment. And while that's a wonderfully rich source of dynamicism and competitiveness, people can also be extremely irritating. And the use of technology and the adoption of technology in all different aspects is a perfect example of this. You could plausibly predict 10 years ago that people would care less about being in a concentrated urban environment, would be more prone to remote working, would build more relationships remotely. And there is evidence to suggest that the whole social media phenomenon has created that dynamic and is an exemplar of it. Yet we live in an era of mass urbanization. And that urbanization is increasing in pace in cities like London, where people have access to the technology not to come into the city center. We recently completed a project with the London Enterprise Panel called An Economic Development Agenda for London. It's an attempt to look at London's economy to 2036, the latest point at which we predict there will be 10 million inhabitants inside the 32 boroughs and the city. And it uncovers all sorts of wonderful nuances, but fundamentally, what it tries to address is what's going to create more jobs and more economic growth. And the reality is that as we become more productive, we need, and we use technology, and we use disruptive technology to become more productive, we end up losing jobs in certain key sectors that are amongst the most high-paying and which fuel a lot of the affluence and the X factor of London. So there are all sorts of contradictions in human behavior patterns, and then in terms of the use of disruptive technologies, I think we really need to accept, as Martin was saying, that actually to treat it as a distinct phenomenon is a little bit of a blind alley. We're all part of a disruptive universe. We're all using technology. And while we wouldn't have predicted that more people would want to work in the city, we probably also wouldn't have predicted how people are much more self-managing in all sorts of consumer patterns. So 20 years ago, would you have predicted that somebody would be happy shifting utility providers without ever speaking to anybody? An entirely sort of impersonal relationship developed online. Would you have predicted that, I would take my family to McDonald's for lunch and I would order everything without speaking to anybody and collect it? So there's a lot of customer service where we're becoming increasingly self-managing. Yet as a populace, as a dynamic, vibrant, globally competitive populace, we're also more demanding. We're becoming more demanding of our communities, our urban realm, and our public spaces. And where they aren't succeeding, they're having a deteriorating impact on our competitiveness as a city. So I think to the extent that I'd offer any advice, I would say three things. We need to accept that disruptive technologies are real, that we're all experiencing them now. So whether we're developing a couple of flats or a huge new development, we need to try to use it and to harness it. As part of that, we need to get rid of some of the weird contradictions. So the planning process in London is so cumbersome and takes so long from initial conception to actual build that all sorts of technologies that would make our buildings more efficient aren't used, because that would involve going back for planning permission over here. And the thought of losing that window is just insupportable in an urban environment where people are already having to accept a massively extended investment cycle. That's just a simple way of accepting it. And I think we need to integrate it. If you look at something like waste collection in London, it came up in one of the videos I was watching. We have within our big data set right now, the ability to read a lot more of what is being used in London's infrastructure and to coordinate it better. A traffic jam with rubbish lorries at 4:30 in the morning on a high street that sits across a borough boundary is an example of us just not being integrated in any way, shape, or form. And I think the third thing is we need to be pragmatic. There are things we can do now that aren't expensive, that may be yesterday's technology, but at least they're not the last decade's technology. And we might as well put them in place now and get them done so that we can begin to evolve into what I would call, with the small s, a smarter city.